got something for me?
I'll have it for you tomorrow.
I didn't see nothing.
That's for your bad eyesight, son.
Meet John Frederick Chow Hayes, Australia's first gangster. He was a violent standover man and convicted murderer. For over 3 decades, he wreaked havoc on the streets of Sydney. John Frederick Chow Hayes, the very name, brought fear to the people of Sydney for 3 decades. Through dramatised scenes, first-hand accounts and analysis of Hayes' life, Australian Crime Stories will trace his career from child thug to celebrity criminal. At just 23 years of age, Hayes was described in the New South Wales Criminal Register as a robber, gangster and thief. The term gangster had only recently been coined in the United States with the rise of organised crime figures like Al Capone and Charles Lucky Luciano. But this was no throwaway line. The police considered Hayes to be Australia's first gangster.
Chow Hayes was a violent outsider from the get-go.
He had a reputation of being a nightmare, of being a monster, of being someone who, if you opened the door and he was there, you knew you were dead.
Hayes understood that as long as I am regarded as a person who will immediately resort to violence, you must be scared of me and I must not ever back down.
My name's Fred. People call me Chow.
Chow Hayes certainly became the most feared gangster in Sydney.
Don't know where it came from. Must be the eyes. They say they're the window to the soul, and maybe he didn't have one.
Hayes understood that his reputation for violence was the key to his criminal success. He bashed, clubbed and murdered his way to the top of Sydney's crime scene in the 1930s, and he remained there for the next 3 decades. He was not afraid to kill in front of witnesses. His reputation always preceded him, and he knew that anyone who saw him at his worst would be loath to stand up in court and testify against him. Hayes revelled in the gangster lifestyle, yet his one true love, Topsy, was a squeaky clean housewife who stood by her man despite being eyewitness to one of his murders. Hayes only ever admitted to killing on 5 occasions. However, most believe that the real number is at least double that, including the gunning down of an unknown gangster outside a nightclub in Sydney. While painting Hayes for the prestigious Archibald Portrait Prize, artist Bill Leake asked him to confirm whether the bad eyesight story was true.
When I was painting him, I said, Chow, I've heard some incredibly interesting stories about you, and I often wonder if they're true. And he said, to be all bullshit. And I said, I heard that there was a violent incident involving you and another man at Taylor Square, and the bloke selling the newspapers was the only witness to it. And he said, yeah, that'd be right. And he said, I went back and bought a newspaper off him. And I said, I heard you gave him £20 for that newspaper. And he said, well, put it this way, Bill. It was a bloody lot of money for a newspaper.
Hayes' criminal career extended over half a century, from his first conviction for stealing in 1920 to the violent assault on a man 50 years later. His record is one of the most extensive in Australian history.
Chow Hayes was a violent outsider from the get-go, capable of violence without restraint, without let or hindrance. We have to guess that it was fueled by a great reservoir of anger and rage, a man of the inner city working class who never did a day's work in his life, a man who killed without remorse, a man who lived his life seemingly without any remorse.
When I fired the gun, I made sure that I hit him. Well, I made sure that I tried to kill him because you didn't know whether they was going to back up or not.
By back up, you mean come back to get you?
Yeah. 99 times out of 100 they would.
Well, Chow Hayes was certainly the most feared, most notorious, most violent criminal of his era, of the 30s, 40s and 50s. He was a person who believed society, as he saw it, was divided into squareheads, those who upheld the law, went to church on Sundays, doffed their hat at a lady in the street, gave up a seat on the bus for women, and basically had nothing to do with the criminal class. He, on the other hand, thought that it was, without any remorse, okay to be involved in bashing, slashing, razoring, and eventually shooting, as long as this took place among the criminals.
There is no doubt that he beat up, wounded, maimed probably scores of people. It came with the territory of what he did as an extortionist and a standover man. His modus operandi is violence. I would say scores, possibly hundreds of times he would have been involved in fights. It was his currency. That's what he did. He threatened, he hit, he fired guns at people.
I think people were absolutely scared out of their wits about this bloke because he had a reputation of being a nightmare, of being a monster, of being someone who, if you opened the door and he was there, you knew you were dead.
Frederick Chow Hayes never showed a moment's remorse or regret for his murderous life.
And do you feel any remorse for it now?
A sociopath has no remorse and doesn't have the ability to feel guilty. They always blame somebody else. So for somebody like Hayes, who never had any remorse for murdering somebody, he would have that old thought in his head, well, he had it coming, that it's always somebody else's fault and that if he got murdered, well, he should have looked twice, shouldn't he?
The world's a hostile place. I'm going to get in first. I don't care about anybody. No one's going to care about me, so I don't sure as hell care about anybody else. I'm going to get what I want. And just, if you stand in my way, then that's just your tough luck.
John Frederick Hayes was born in 1911 in Sydney. He grew up in the inner city suburb of Glebe, in those days poverty and crime-stricken. As a boy, he attacked another child. The boy responded with insults, calling him a dirty Chow, thinking Hayes was of Asian descent. The nickname stuck and Hayes would be referred to as Chow for the remainder of his life.
When he was 3 years old, his father, who was working in the country as a ringbarker, came down to Sydney and joined up with the Light Horsemen and went off to the First World War. Hayes moved into a house down near the railway with his mother and his grandmother and his grandfather. His grandfather subsequently died of the bubonic plague in Sydney in 1920. At the same time, the war had ended in 1918, so Hayes had had no father figure at home from age 3.
Well, the First World War was like a giant wrecking ball through the male population of Australia, and particularly the cities. It left families without brothers and fathers, and it left a generation with a very disturbed, totally absent mentor generation. Boys the age of Chow Hayes, who were brought up with very shadowy fathers at best. It didn't make for happy home lives, nor did it make for well-adjusted and focused young men.
Don't forget, in the 1920s, post-World War I, there were a lot of angry young men around the place. A lot of blokes didn't come back to live the wonderful white picket fence dream. They came back and they had no job and no family. They'd had all sorts of horrible experiences in the First World War. Some had come back disfigured, so that they were no strangers to doing it rough and to living a violent life. So there was no shortage of young blokes you could employ to go around and belt someone if you needed to run your crime empire.
Hayes grew up in the shadows of World War I. Australia's population at the start of the First World War was just 5 million. 417,000 men were enlisted. Over 60,000 were killed and 156,000 were wounded, gassed or taken prisoner. Hayes' father was one of the thousands of soldiers who returned to Australia physically and mentally scarred by the horrors of the war.
Why didn't he want to march?
Your father's very sick, darling. He needs to stay in bed and get his rest.
But everybody else is marching, even Uncle Leo, and he's only got one leg.
Well, Uncle Leo's lucky he can get up. Your father can't.
I don't want to go to school today.
Well, that's exactly where you're going.
I want to see Dad.
You can't, darling. He's in the hospital.
I just want to see what he looks like.
I'm sorry, Freddie, you can't. You got to go to school.
That's not fair. I want to see Dad. I want to see Dad.
Now remember, he's not well, Freddie.
I know. I just want to see him.
Chow was about 11 years of age, and his father was in a straitjacket at the time when he met him. And I think it must have been a horrific experience for him, although he would never admit that it had been.
So Hayes, in fact, grew up with his father never being there and then dying, a grandfather briefly being there when he was very young and then dying, and so being in a household only with females. He had no male father figure. And he realised from when he was about 8 or 9 years old that, in fact, the women in his life were not going to assert any authority over him.
Forensic psychologist Bob Montgomery sees the lack of a male authority figure in Hayes' life as a major factor in his criminal development.
There's a long history of evidence showing the absence of a father or a father figure. An adult male who shows this is proper behaviour, rewards acceptable behaviour, sets an example. The absence of that has long been known as a risk factor for all forms of delinquency. He's actually lost his father figure, twice. That's tough for kids. And what it teaches you is you can't trust relationships. You get involved with someone and suddenly they'll abandon you. That kind of history would say this is someone who's going to have real difficulty forming any sort of intimate, close relationship with any sense of security.
What we need to keep in mind, what we need to bear in mind, is that there's lots of people, especially during that era, that had similar kinds of difficult childhoods. The question to ask is, why did Chow Hayes end up the way that he did versus other people in similar situations turning out to be law-abiding citizens?
Hayes was certainly not on his own in being without a father figure, but he turned to crime. At 11 years of age, Hayes started running with a gang of youths known as the Railway Gang. Hayes and his gang of toughs would hang around Sydney's bustling Central Railway Station and prey on new arrivals, bash and rob them. Hayes and his gang became expert thieves and would often shoplift from the department stores of Sydney. Hayes may have been a clever thief, but he was so active that he was always coming to the attention of police.
What happened to Hayes was he found himself at age 14, after half a dozen convictions for shoplifting, being sent to Gosford Boys' Home. It was the classic case of the university for criminals. Half a dozen to a dozen of the leading criminals over the next 20 years in Sydney all went through the same process, and it absolutely set Hayes on a course, as far as he was concerned, where he learnt everything by the time he was 17 about being a criminal. Most of all, he learnt you cannot back down at any stage. He was going to absolutely assert his authority in Sydney as a standover man in the future.
Prison for a juvenile is often seen as a gladiator school.
You learn to become antisocial because antisocial is the norm. And prisons are the adult version of that. You go into prison and you go into prison with the view, I have to be a certain person, otherwise I'm going to be victimised in prison.
These kids start to get into trouble early, so they start to mix with the other kids who are getting into trouble. They may be sent to an institution where they're actually locked up with kids who are really good at getting into trouble. And we've known for a long time from American research, the worst thing you do with juvenile delinquents is put them into a treatment program with other juvenile delinquents.
After his release from Gosford Boys' Home, Hayes returned to crime and eventually came to the attention of one of the queens of the Sydney crime scene, Kate Lee. Hayes joined a network as a standover man collecting from SP bookies.
And how much were you standing over them for?
Oh. SP bookie, £5, £5, like $10 a day's money.
And if they didn't deliver that payment, what would you do?
Close it up.
How would you close it?
Smash it up to pieces, smash them up with it.
Use your razors?
Yeah.
Well, I guess one of the main weapons in the armoury of any extortionist or standover man is a reputation for violence. One thing that Hayes had in common with a number of the other successful criminals at the time was this propensity to explode into sudden rage. Hayes had a reputation as having a hair-trigger temper.
Hayes's biographer, David Hickey, believes one incident in particular made Hayes's early reputation.
A major criminal in Sydney of the day was a guy named Frank Green. He's a serious criminal who has serious convictions, carries a gun. Hayes sees him at a party. Green comes up to Hayes and says, "You were eyeing off my woman." And Hayes said, "No, I wasn't." And he said, "Yes, you were, and I don't like it." 4 hours later, Frank Green comes out of the party and Hayes says, words to the effect, "I've got a present for you," and immediately whacks him with the metal pipe across the head. He goes down, he's semi-conscious, and Hayes then kicks him and gives him a hell of a kicking, such that Green is actually in hospital for the next 4 weeks. It absolutely is one of the landmark episodes that makes Hayes' reputation. And here's the new guy to be feared in Sydney, Chow Hayes.
Hayes moved into adulthood as Sydney's underworld was set to explode in what became known as the Razor Wars. Turf wars fought in Sydney's inner suburbs between criminal gangs wielding straight razors. To these men, an L-shaped scar on the cheek was a badge of honour. Hayes too carried a razor, but he instinctively understood that he needed to up the ante. If the most violent men of Sydney carried razors, well, Hayes would do one better. Chow Hayes would turn to the gun.
Pony, precious. You work for Tilly, don't you?
He's asking.
Me? I was just wondering how a man can call himself a man when he bludgers off shoeless.
Listen, boy. You look like you should be shining shoes on George Street. If you want to get any older, you'll keep your mouth shut, finish your beer, and walk out slowly. You got me on a bad day, son.
What's a good day for a bludger, then? What's a good day for a man who takes his orders from an old slut in a brothel?
Go back to school, son, before you get hurt.
You're gonna have to do better than that, bludger. My name's Fred. People call me Chow. You tell that old mould divine I want 50 quid in my hand every week, and if she falls behind in the payments, I'm gonna come and find you, and I'm gonna shoot you. and I'll shoot every bludgeon bastard like you she sends round to back you up.
You'll need an army.
I got one. An army of one. And if I get any more cheek out of you, I'll wipe the floor with your blood-stained carcass. And then I'll pay her a visit. Chow Hayes. Remember the name? You tell her she owes Chow Hayes.
She ain't gonna like this.
I'm not asking her to like it. I'm telling her to cop it sweet.
Unlike anywhere else in the world, these razor gangs popped up. The razor is a frightening, dreadful symbol. I mean, it's not like in the United States and Chicago where you might come out with a Tommy gun and let somebody have it from a distance of 50 metres. You can conceal them anywhere, in a sock, in your coat, in your hat. And when they come out, you come up to someone and you're so close you can smell them. And just the fear that you can imagine when someone produces one of these things and you know you're going to be cut wide open. It's just a dreadful weapon.
And do you remember carrying a razor?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah.
How would you use it?
Just slash her.
Across where?
Or forward, nose, face, chest, arm, anyway.
A pretty lethal weapon.
Yeah, very lethal.
What happened next in your career?
I got a gun then.
Do you remember your first weapon?
Yeah.
What was it?
38.
Chow Hayes was one of those people who was okay with guns. He liked guns. He was not afraid to use a gun. So Chow's response to a razor would have been, pull a gun. This is what put him in a class separate from most others like him. Use the gun if necessary and shoot to kill.
Hayes saw no threat from men wielding razors. He knew his notoriety as the toughest man in Sydney was based on him always being the quickest, cruelest and most violent. By the 1930s, Hayes had established himself as one of the most feared men in Sydney. He routinely shot and wounded men who stood in his way. He knew he would not survive as a standover man unless he was prepared to go further than the competition. Hayes had a close association with Kate Lee, but that didn't stop him attacking her foot soldiers. In 1936, Chow shot one of Kate Lee's henchmen, Jack Baker.
I was at the Lansdowne Hotel and this bloke over there, he'd just come over from Melbourne. Found out later his name was Baker. So he asked me what I was doing there. I said, I'm going to see old Kate, you know. He said, yeah, I'm looking after. He said, we don't want you there. And he come over, you know, singlet, flexing his muscles. What do you want? Oh, I want to give you this present. I shot him 3 times. 3 times in the stomach.
Then in 1945, Hayes murdered Sydney criminal Eddie Wayman, shooting him 5 times as he lay in his bed. Hayes was charged with the murder but was acquitted on trial. He was also in and out of prison for other crimes. 6 months here, a year there. But he saw his spells behind bars as an occupational hazard.
Through the 1920s, 30s and 40s leading up to the war, Chow Hayes has an unbelievable criminal record where there's dozens of appearances in court. He never quite got that, in fact, half his life was ebbing away until he was a very old man, when he suddenly realised he'd spent more than half his life in jail. What he just understood was, this is my life, it's almost my occupation, because all he cared about was, as soon as he was out of jail, you had to quickly re-establish that you were the toughest guy in Sydney. Your reputation relied on that so that you could automatically collect the standover without having to do much about it. If you didn't, there would be other young up-and-comers who would want to establish their reputation as the toughest man in Sydney, and he wasn't going to let that happen no matter what.
Forensic psychologist Stephen Barron sees Hayes' single-mindedness as behaviour typical of a psychopath.
People who have psychopathy are extremely antisocial. They have their own set of rules which are grounded on their own experience and value systems, and those value systems and rules that they live by often bear no resemblance to the ones that you and I are supposed to live by. Psychopaths occupy lawyers' offices, they're CEOs of companies, they're highly successful, charismatic, charming, productive people. I suppose to get to the top of the food chain, you need a certain level of focus. And psychopaths have this kind of focus. They're ambitious, their families come second, third and fourth, and they do the job that they have to do to the best of their ability, and that's their value system.
One of his most infamous deeds was the murder of Bobby Lee in 1951. Lee was a boxer who had banged heads with members of Hayes's gang, and he knew that Hayes would come looking for him. Lee decided to get in first. He went to Hayes's home and shot and killed his nephew, Danny Simmons, in a case of mistaken identity.
Hayes was supposed to be at home one night, just listening to the radio at home. In fact, he went out, but his nephew, Danny Simmons, did stay home listening to the radio, and while he was sitting in the lounge room, somebody, which in fact was Bobby Lee, snuck up and shot Danny Simmons through the window of Chow Hayes' house, believing it was Chow. Subsequently, over the next couple of weeks, Hayes and his key ally of the time, Joey Hollowbone, make raids in the evening on a couple of houses because they've had tips that Bobby Lee is staying there. In fact, they miss Lee. But the word gets around that Hayes and Hollowbone have busted into several houses looking for you, and the heat is on. They had guns. They're going to finish you.
Oh, look at that.
I reckon you're bluffing.
Well, you better be right. I'll raise you 10.
You'd better not be. Have a look at me. Go on.
Okay, then. Oh, I better be going, so... You're on.
Nice work.
Thanks. But I've got to run, boys. It's that time. You're not going to try and bluff Hayes, are you?
Who's bluffing me, mate? I've got him running scared.
Well, not what I hear.
What do you hear?
I hear he's got ears all over town looking for you.
That'd be Hayes looking for someone using his ears.
Just keep your eyes open.
They're open. Hey, why don't you come down to the Ziegfeld room tonight? There's a new bird on from the Philippines. You'd never pick her as a fella, they reckon.
Nah, mate. Family night tonight. Blokes getting their gear off, I don't know.
You came to watch me fight.
I'll leave you to it. Watch out for Hayes, all right?
He's not going to shoot me at the Ziegfeld room, is he? There'll be 300 people there. I'll be sweet. I'll watch out for him with one ear, and I'll have the other ear on the Filipina.
Chow. Little birdie told me that Bobby Lee's going to be at the Ziegfeld Club tonight.
After 3 or 4 weeks, Hayes gets a red-hot tip that Bobby Lee, tonight, will be at the Ziegfeld Club in King Street in Sydney.
And this was Chow's opportunity to go down there and get back at him for the shooting of Danny Simmons. He made a fatal mistake by telling his wife that he was going to the Ziegfeld room, and she said, I love to go dancing. And of course he wasn't in a position to say, well, actually, I'm not going there to dance. I'm going down there to shoot somebody.
When they arrive at the Ziegfeld Club, there's between 80 and 100 people already in there. Grog is flowing, there's lots of noise, and Hayes immediately sees that Bobby Lee is, in fact, at a table down in the club.
As soon as Bobby Lee saw Chow at the bar, he surrounded himself with people at a table, for obvious reasons, and refused to move.
Hayes decides it's now or never. He goes over to the table where Lee is. Lee is startled to see Hayes there.
And Chow comes up to him and he says something like, well, you're not going to do anything to me. We're sitting in a room full of people. And Chow just gets his gun out and says something like, you're going to fucking get yours. Bang, 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 on the ground, right through the head.
Apparently the force of the impact of the bullet threw him about 10 feet back off his chair. And Chow very calmly walked around, stood over the top of him and pumped a few more bullets into his head.
With most psychopaths, again, they tend to be very impulsive in their behavior, reckless and irresponsible, and again, their violence is instrumental. So for what we might see as kind of behavior where he just snapped, Hayes this might have been just within his character to go and behave that way without regard for the consequences, and again, remorselessly.
Hayes went on the run, but was captured weeks later. However, not one witness came forward to identify him as the killer. There were 2 mistrials before Hayes finally pleaded guilty. He did so only because he feared that his wife Topsy would be charged with being an accessory to the murder. Hayes was sentenced to hang, but he managed to dodge the hangman's noose when the New South Wales government took capital punishment off the books. However, he spent the next 20 years in prison. Meanwhile, his life on the outside fell apart. His wife Topsy, who had witnessed him murder Bobby Lee, began to visit less frequently. Hayes had always been proud that his wife was a squarehead, in other words, not part of the criminal set. She had loved her husband, but his long period of incarceration placed great strain on that love. Hayes had a daughter, also named Topsy, and she too was beginning to turn her back on her father. Increasingly, Hayes found himself alone in the world. Psychologist Janet Hall believes even a man like Hayes would have felt the loss of his wife and family.
One wouldn't think it would be love as normal people would know it, but the need to have that attachment, to know that there is somebody there who cares. She was the mother of his child and the matriarch of the household, and so it would have helped him keep sane, to have that sense of belonging.
He seemed to me to be very proud of the fact that he had a wife who he was able to describe as a squarehead. She was a nurse and was never really fully aware of what he was up to, which was an incredible thing because as Sydney's probably most notorious gangster, it must have been pretty hard to keep it hidden from his own wife. And he said she was a squarehead, but he said it with great pride.
Prison held no fears for Hayes, and neither did the hangman's noose.
He has no emotional feeling about being hanged. That's the sentence. That's what it is. As far as he was concerned, it made no difference. It was just the latest conviction on his criminal record, and he had no emotional feeling about the fact he's been sentenced to hang. Of course, history intervenes and the New South Wales government changes the law, and hanging is no longer going to take place in this state. And Hayes's sentence is commuted to what was then life imprisonment and subsequently becomes a 20-year sentence, and he will eventually get out of jail.
Do you reckon you should have hanged?
Oh, yes.
In jail, Hayes used the only skills he had, extortion and standover tactics. Prison is a tough place, and some of the young crooks would not let Hayes have things his own way. In 1969, he was set upon by a group of prisoners at Parramatta Jail and savagely bashed.
He had so many scars and he looked so knocked about. And I said, and what about this ear of yours, Chow? I said, the one that actually appears in the painting, which was his right ear. And he goes, yes. Bloke bit a bit out of it once. And that's when I realised I was looking at a perfect bite shape, you know, that's just gone out of his ear. He said, doctors said they could have sewed it back on, but he chewed it up a bit first. Tell you the truth, Bill, I never found out who it was. Bloke who bit off me ear. Which left me to wonder how on earth a man can go around biting other people's ears off anonymously.
Russell Cox told me a story about he was in Long Bay and Chow Hayes sent a message over and he said that he wanted some tobacco. Russell Cox said, get your own bloody tobacco. And he sent a message over, he said, do you know who I am? And Russell said, yeah, I know who you are. He said, do you know who I am? And Chow Hayes said, I don't give a fuck bugger who you are, son. He said, just give me some tobacco. And Russell said, I'm not going to give you tobacco. Stick it up your arse, you old bastard. You get nothing out of me. And Chow said, you want to mind your manners, son. He said, otherwise you get your head blown off. And Russell sent him back a message to say, all right, I'll see you when you get out and you can come and blow my head off, you stupid old fart, you know. But he realised then that he'd lost the plot, you know, trying to stand over some young kid for his tobacco, and the young kid told him to go and get fucked. Chow just realised then that he's, you know, he must have lost it.
You do mature, you do slow down, you do get an ability to start to see some sense of perspective in what you're doing. And that applies to a lot of criminals. Biology, genetics, heredity is not destiny. We can learn to manage our makeup. But you take the Chow Hayes case and he was threatening people right to the end. There was no amelioration with age there.
Hayes was released in 1973. He'd spent 18 years in prison for the murder of Bobby Lee. But Hayes was not one to leave his criminal past behind him. Just 6 months out of jail, and 62 years old, Hayes got into a fight in an inner-city bar in Gangster. Hayes was arrested and returned to jail for 5 more years. In 1978, he was released from prison for the last time, having spent more than half of his life in jail.
Chow. G'day. Take a seat. Congratulations.
What for?
Well, you're the owner of the largest corrective services file in the history of New South Wales.
Man does his best.
2 murders, serious assaults, theft, property damage.
Is that all?
Well, I think we both know it's probably not. Look, you're 66, Chow. You've never done a day's work in your life, and you've got no skills. So I'm inclined to think that you're probably beyond rehabilitation.
Look at me, mate. Couldn't pull a skin off a rice pudding. Sure not going to go pick a fight.
So what are you going to do with yourself?
Maybe I'll write a book about my life.
Have you ever written anything before?
It's a pretty good start right there.
Oh, Chow. Look, you left school when you were 12. You're what we call a functional illiterate.
I'll get someone else to write it for me.
Well, who?
I'll find someone. I was always pretty good at getting people to do what I want.
Now that's a problem, Chow. We can't have you going back into society and wreaking havoc. I mean, the press are going to have a field day.
All right, now listen, Frank. Here's the drum. All my enemies are dead. All my mates are either in the ground or coffin chasing. I'm over it. I just want a quiet life. I won't be back in here.
Parole would have approved your release. You're a free man, Chow.
It would have been a baffling and difficult Sydney, and particularly inner Sydney, for Chow when he got out in 77. There were blokes with long hair and beards and funny shirts, smoking funny drugs. A lot of the old, hard people had moved out to the new suburbs outside Sydney.
For any offender who spends a fair amount of time within a prison, it's like their maturation just stops. So for anybody who has done life by the installment plan, when they actually come out, that generally not only has life passed them by, that people that they may have cared about may have moved on, technology must have moved on, all those kinds of things.
And so the criminal background that Hayes relied on had largely changed, and now it was the drug trade. Most of the people that he knew for many decades had either died or had grown old, had disappeared, and he found himself almost with nothing to do and no one to stand over. There was no longer a place for a criminal whose time seemed generations ago, and Hayes found himself as a fish out of water.
He might have simply faded away, but his ego would not allow it. He still wanted to be a man to be reckoned with. In 1987, Hayes approached Australian journalist David Hickey. He wanted his story told. Initially reluctant, Hickey agrees to meet with him. He was interested in exploring the psyche of a career criminal like Hayes. While Hickey's aims were of an academic nature, it's clear that Hayes wanted to cash in on his criminal past.
After 3 years of taping and then 2 years of editing those transcripts and talking them through with various other people in the criminal world and other police that I wanted to check all the facts with, the book was published in 1990, and we then went on the celebrated author tour. In fact, no one was interested in the author, everyone was interested in the subject. And Chow, who was by that stage an old man, nevertheless had a presence that anybody at any of the radio stations or the TV stations who met him will never forget.
Can you understand that for a person like me, it's a strange sensation to sit opposite a man who's one of the most brutal murderers that this state has ever known?
Yeah.
And it doesn't move you, does it?
No. No.
Do you think that's because you're old now and it's really in the past?
No, it wouldn't have moved me in the young days.
He was a man who would walk in, he would sit behind the radio microphone, he would be asked the first question. Without blinking an eye, he would give the details of how he brutally murdered someone, how he shot someone, what he thought about that, and every interviewer, without exception, would almost recoil in horror as they realised here was a person who just had absolutely no compunction about telling them, I took a person's life, here I am, what do you want to know?
He's laying on the bed in his singlet. By that, I said, he's yours.
And how many times did you shoot him?
5.
In his old age, Hayes tapped into the growing fascination with violent crime and criminals. In Australia, it's often referred to as the Ned Kelly phenomenon, the mythologising of outlaws and murderers like Hayes.
So, Ned Kelly phenomenon, it exists in many, many cultures. We mythologise them, we hold them up as being heroes of some sort against authority, which is often faceless and punitive and overreaching. But gangsters, I think it really is about us, the darkness inside of us, the interest we have with people who are interestingly different and a little dangerous.
Australians seem to have a fascination with criminals, but you forget that they're like a funnel web spider. Like, they're okay to talk about with your mates down the pub, but you don't want one in the kitchen. You know, you don't want a Chow Hayes at home.
I got this idea that I really wanted to paint Chow Hayes, you know, first because he was such a villain, and as Australians we revere our villains, and I've always regretted that nobody got an opportunity to do a painting of Ned Kelly before he died. If someone had done that, it'd be Australia's equivalent of the Mona Lisa, because a painting from life gives the viewer an opportunity to know what it was like to share the same space with that person, breathe the same air. And so I became convinced that I had an historical responsibility to paint this bloke. There was something dead about his eyes. He was like a lizard. He'd only blink about every 10 minutes. And he could look you straight in the eye, and just by looking at you, you could feel very, very uneasy. Don't know where it came from. Must be the eyes. They say they're the window to the soul, and maybe he didn't have one.
Hayes the Gangster had transformed himself into a celebrity criminal, Australia's first, but by no means last. While posing for Leak's portrait, it became clear Hayes was ill. He was riddled with cancer. Death was catching up with the old murder.
G'day, son.
How you going?
As good as a dying man can.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Can I get you anything?
Yeah. There is one thing.
Yeah?
You know that clown who used to work in the papers?
Dave, yeah?
That's him. You think you can find him?
Yeah, I can find out.
Could you do that? He owes me a few bob.
Oh, look, I don't know about that, Chow.
About $6 grand by my reckoning.
$6 grand?
Listen, son. I've only got a little bit of time left. You tell that mug he's no friend of mine. He owes me 6 large.
Yeah, OK, mate, I'll tell him, but just settle yourself down, OK?
You tell that bastard. If he doesn't pay me, he's got big problems.
Take it easy, eh?
If I have to crawl out of this bed and drag myself down there to find him myself, then I will.
Look, I promise, I'll tell him.
And after I finish crawling down there, I'll fucking shoot him. You tell him.
Yeah, well, take it easy, mate.
I can't have people taking liberties. I've got a reputation to uphold. Next thing you know, they'll be robbing my grave.
He was in such a terrible state. He was coughing up shards of his lungs, I think. I couldn't tell what it was, but it didn't look too good to me. And I passed on regards from David Hickey, because I told David that I was going out there to see him the next day or something. And he just said, "Don't talk to me about Hickey." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because he robbed me." He honestly believed that the book that David wrote about him was going to be an international bestseller. He seriously believed that David was squirreling away millions. And I said, "Oh, so," I said, "you're still a bit dirty on him, eh, Chow?" He said, "Dirty?" He said, "Bill, I'm going to shoot him." And I said, "I don't think you're in a fit state to do that, mate." And he said, "If I have to crawl in there, I'm going to go into his office at the Sydney Morning Herald and I'll wait outside his door, and when he comes out, I'll bloody well shoot him."
I said to him every time I saw him, "Chow, there's no money in this book. There's no money in this project. You know, I'm telling you, I'm interested in the psychology of the criminal mind." However, even up to his deathbed, he is still interested in threatening from the bed, "You owe me money, you know, you're going to make money out of this project and I want the money." He just couldn't move away from the fact that the standover had been there for 40 years, the threats, and he's got weeks to live. That's where he is.
There is a mythology out there that psychopaths burn out, or that they, eventually develop a conscience, or those kinds of things. We don't generally see that development of gosh, I'm sorry, that kind of remorsefulness and begging forgiveness.
So the psychopathic criminal who revels in his own grandiosity, his own reputation, who sees his evil, dangerous background as something to be held up as being ultra-masculine, that makes him separate, he's kind of not wanting to learn.
And do you feel any remorse for it now?
No.
Does that strike you as odd?
Not really, no. It's either me or them. Those tough days, and we get to go with the tough.
Well, it wasn't really either you or them. You could have walked away from most of those.
Oh, yes, could have walked away, but you'd have lost face if you'd have walked away.
Chow Hayes went to his grave completely unrepentant. Nearing his death, he remarked to Bill Leake that he measured the worth of a man by the number of people at his funeral. If the cemetery was full of mourners, Hayes believed the man had lived a full life and had been respected by his peers. Hayes was buried in a simple ceremony in front of just 5 people. The old gangster who had murdered his way to the top of Sydney's mean streets was gone, and despite his notoriety, few cared when he died.